Thanks for joining the show today. On my show is a guest I met through Instagram. He started following me after we made a connection through Donate Life America, the organization that is involved in organ donation throughout the country. And he has an amazing story. I started following him, he was following me, and now we're here having Steve Wynn on the show. I'm going to tell you more about him, but first I want to say hello. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for following me. This is how I find amazing stories like yours with people who are out there living it and sharing it. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
So I want the audience to know straight away that you're a 2-time kidney transplant recipient. And I'm going to save some of it for a little bit later in the show, but definitely want to share that you had a childhood disease and let you tell about your life before transplant, which happened for you at 27 years old, the first one. So what was the disease that you had that led you to transplant? You had it since infancy, correct?
Yeah, I was actually born with just one kidney that worked. We found that as we started to work up my problems. So really just born with one kidney, which for most people is fine. But that one kidney was injured by a congenital problem called urinary reflux, where urine comes up into the kidney and starts a slow process of decline, at least for me, in kidney function. So that happened as an infant. The urine backed up into my good remaining kidney, and from there, really throughout my childhood, we kind of watched my function slowly digress, my kidney function. And I kind of grew up knowing that at some point I would need a transplant, but lived a pretty normal life up through high school and beyond.
You didn't require dialysis or anything like that in those years?
Not. Interestingly, I had what's called a fistula, which is creating a large vein for dialysis, surgically prepared in case I needed dialysis, but I was able to scoot right into my transplant. So but at about 24, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry. When you talk about always knowing that you were eventually going to have a transplant, no one really knows what that's like until, even when they try to prepare you as you're being evaluated, you don't really know the magnitude of it until you're in it. And I think that some of that's a little deliberate. It's too much to take in, and you don't even know necessarily that you'll get the organ. So they kind of take it a step at a time.
Yeah.
And in your case, growing up knowing it would probably lead to that, how much of that did you understand? And did that create a weight for you, or you just part of you?
No, a good question. And I've thought about that because to me as a kid, I mean, even before my maybe early teenage years, when I heard of transplant, I thought, ooh, that sounds kind of neat. That'll be cool. And without having any knowledge of really what it meant, because it's a huge operation. It changes your life as far as medications and that sort of thing. So it was kind of like, ooh, that's a cool thing. But at about 23 or 24, I started seeing my blood pressure go up, which had never been a problem. My creatinine, which is a fairly specific measure of kidney function, as you know, started to go up as well. And I started having closer follow up with my doctors. I was just finishing up my undergraduate degree, and maybe it was a little bit of the timing of where I was in life, but that coinciding with worsening numbers and some symptoms that started to creep in as far as the kidney not working well. All of that kind of combined to make a good time for me to progress towards a transplant.
Now, up to this point, you mentioned before off camera that your parents didn't coddle you. They raised you as a sick child.
Yeah.
So what was your upbringing like, and how much did your disease impact it?
Well, the main thing is because of some underlying problems associated with the reflux, it was pretty typical that I would be in the ER at least once a month. So that was just part of the life I grew up with. And again, as we talked before camera time, my parents didn't coddle me. We were a very active family. We'd go on trips, we'd hike, we'd bike. I remember a time or two being out in the middle of nowhere and having to go to the ER in this small little town. No one knew the condition I had, and me and my mom, me being about 7 or 8 years old, kind of had to tell the doctors what they had
You have to do that sometimes, even in big cities, depending on where you live. Yes.
Yeah. So, but I really am appreciative of my parents not saying, "Oh, you better not do this, you better not do that," because that's part of who I am now, that I don't allow my disease to keep me from doing what I want.
So you got up through undergraduate school, graduated from college, we're about to graduate college. And so you were 27 years old when you get your first transplant. How long were you listed before that transplant?
Well, it turns out that I've got 4 other siblings and a mom and a dad who all tested first. It's interesting. I actually had a sister who was a match and my dad who was a match. My dad was 65, but very healthy. And in some cases, they wouldn't have accepted him because he was actually 67, I think. But he, being so active physically and taking care of his health, was able to donate his kidney.
What an interesting decision, though, also for your family to make. Because he's probably wanting to protect your sister too, right?
Yes, it was, I think, hard for everyone. We come from a pretty close family, and my mom still talks about how she wishes she could have donated. And you know, I had a brother who I was very close to, and he kind of felt let down that he couldn't donate. When push came to shove, it was more the transplant team's decision to have my dad being the donor. So down the road, if I needed another transplant, my sister might become the next donor.
And it is important. And I think that that's part of why they make these decisions for us, right? So that they have a lot more information and experience. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about your life. I mean, you had that transplant for many years, 26 years, that kidney, from 1987, which I don't know how long they told you it would last back then, but you know, transplant wasn't as common then. And for you to have had that particular kidney, what a gift your father was able to give you. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to share more about your transplant story and get to the really cool stuff as well, in addition to the medical stuff, the live in your life stuff about your transplant to Trails, which is where I follow you on Instagram. We'll be right back. We're talking with Steve Wynn. You can check him out on Instagram. It's transplant_TO_trails. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm here talking with Steve Wynn today. I found him on Instagram. When he found me on Instagram, our connection is organ donation and how it's touched each of our lives. Steve, you've been sharing with us how you lived 27 years with a disease that you had since you were a child, which you kind of always knew would lead to transplant, and it did. You received the transplant from your father's donated kidney. He was 67 years old, and this was in 1987. When you received that transplant, the first one, did they tell you how long they thought it would last, or did they really have any way of knowing back then?
There really wasn't a lot. I mean, I guess if I'd have really looked, I maybe could have found some studies, but there really was no talk about how long this will last. And as we mentioned beforehand, before we were on camera, as I got to 9 and 10 and 12 years, I started asking, so, you know, what can I expect as far as this kidney to last? And they'd say, we don't know. We don't have anyone that's really gone this long. And I'm sure there were, but I was a little bit of an anomaly as far as the length of time that my kidney had lasted, even at 10 to 15 years.
And you're going along the way, you know, 5 years go by, 10 years go by. And just to be clear, you're still you're still having to go to the doctor. You're still having to have medication. hospitals and, well, doctors are part of your life? Were you hospitalized during that time, or did you have a pretty successful?
I've really been lucky. I have enjoyed good health.
So the quality of life was maintained through your transplant.
It has been, yeah.
It maybe even improved, because you said when you were ill or when you had the disease, you were hospitalized maybe once a month. So that obviously wasn't the case once you were transplanted.
Well, not hospitalized, but had to go in for some procedures and stuff. And again, I was pretty healthy. I mean, I was able to graduate from college and keep up with studies, and so I was pretty healthy. And some transplant patients will talk about waking up from surgery and within 12 hours feeling so much better. I mean, I didn't go into my first transplant feeling awful.
Right.
In fact, my second transplant, I probably was sicker than my first.
So when you had your first transplant, did that essentially cure you of the disease you'd lived with since?
Yes, it did.
That there's value in that as well, obviously.
Yep.
So you have your transplant, and then you decide to attend medical school.
So being in and out of doctor's offices through my younger years kind of ingrained in me a desire to be a physician. And so the day that I was supposed to walk for my undergraduate graduation, I actually was getting my transplant. I had applied to medical school earlier in the year, got accepted at an out-of-state program, but for financial reasons and practical reasons, I turned that down, reapplied the following year, and got into medical school at an in-state school at the University of Utah. So attended medical school, never had any problems, went out of state for 3 years for my residency. And, you know, by that time I was seeing a doctor once or twice a year, and again, enjoyed really, really good health. Just real briefly, it wasn't until about 24 years or so out from my first transplant, my creatinine slowly again started to go up a bit. And
by now you've almost doubled your life.
Yes.
You were 27 when you had it, and you didn't have your second transplant until you were 26.
Yeah.
I mean,
till 26 years
later. So you were 27
yes.
when you had the first one, and you had the second one 26 years later.
Yes.
So you're 53 years old with this kidney that you received from your father. When you started to have, again, symptoms that this kidney had its time was due, was it your sister who donated at that point?
No, that's an interesting story. And I should just mention, my dad, by the time I got my second transplant, they don't take the kidney out, the first one out, they just leave the kidney in. So by that time, my dad was about 92. He died at about 94 years of age, and his organ donation was never an issue with his health. So, you know, that was always nice for me. My sister
he lived like almost 30 years beyond the transplant he gave you.
Yeah.
He got to see all of that. So he was alive then when you had your second transplant.
Yes, he was.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. So my sister was tested because of the strict qualifications. She was found to have a very mild kidney disease that probably will never affect her life, but she wasn't an acceptable candidate. By this time, I actually had a daughter who was old enough to be tested. She was a match, but she was just starting a family. And again, the transplant team felt it was better for me to go on a cadaveric list. So I was reasonably healthy, but really tired.
And that means you won't be receiving it from a living donor.
Right. And again, I was healthy enough that I didn't need dialysis. One of the funny stories that my wife and I laugh about is as I'd go to work, seeing sick patients at work, one of my wife's favorite questions to ask was, "Did you see anyone sicker than you today?" So that last year or two on the waiting list, I would wear out by the end of the day. And that sort of thing.
So you
But again,
graduated medical school and you became a family practice physician.
yes,
So you
yes,
you still practice medicine today.
I do. Yeah.
What a purposeful life you're living.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. So you received, how long did it take then? So it was 26 years after your first transplant. How long were you listed before you received it?
About 2.5 years.
Do you know if it was any harder those years ago than it is now? That was in 2013 when you received your second one. So
Yeah.
only 8 years ago. But I know that kidneys are one of the longest lists to wait for.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. Part of it is because they can sustain your life,
Hmm.
um, but yet it's also one of the few that you can be a living donor and give.
Right.
So it's
Right.
about
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
when you receive the second one. By now, they know a little bit more about what they're doing and the
Yeah.
prognosis, and you don't want to get too bogged down by the numbers, obviously, because you've lived this really long life. So here you are, you're still thriving, doing well.
Yeah. Yeah. I am. Again, I have been very active throughout my life, and I credit being proactive about my health, being a big contributor to the success of both transplants.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about what it is, so your Instagram is transplant underscore to, like the letters TO underscore to trails. So transplant to trails with an underscore in between each word. And you post some of the most beautiful pictures of the places that you visit. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. When we come
Okay.
back, we're going to talk more. Steve Wynn, if you want to follow him on Instagram, transplant to trails underscore in between the words. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm talking still with Steve Wynn. He is the Instagram guy that I've been following for a while now, since he started following me. We met through Donate Life America, and it's just a pleasure to have you on the show and share your miraculous story, transplant story. Just to refresh the audience, you received your first transplant at the age of 27 from your father, who was approximately 67 years old. You lived with that kidney for 26 years. Your father lived a long, full life, saw you through that entire kidney that he gave you, and didn't pass away until after your second transplant, which you received 26 years later, and you waited a couple of years for that. So that's where we are. And you're a family practice doctor. You went to medical school. You learned a lot from the experience of being a patient. And now I want to get to the outdoor fun stuff. You talked about how your parents didn't coddle you when you were a child, that you weren't the sick kid in the family, and you were outdoorsy. Your family was outdoorsy, and you were able to maintain that through all of your childhood and young adulthood disease. And then your quality of life was improved and maintained through your transplants.
Yeah.
So the hiking, was that always part of what you do? And the trails that you share now publicly on Instagram, tell me how that came to fruition and why it's so important for you to share it.
Yeah. The hiking has always been something that I've done. I live in Salt Lake, or grew up in Salt Lake. Now live about 30 miles north of Salt Lake. So we live right now on the bench of some beautiful mountains. So I grew up hiking. As my family has grown older and maybe I have a little more time, I've gotten more into other sports. About 10 years ago, I picked up cross-country skiing, mountain biking, and then trail running. The name Transplant to Trails actually has a story behind it. After my second transplant, my goal was to run a Xterra race, which is a swim, bike, run. And here in Utah, it's a swim in a open lake, and then a mountain bike ride of about 15 miles up about 2,000, 2,500 feet of elevation, and then a 5K run of another 600 or 700 feet elevation, hence Transplant to Trails. I was able to do that 9 months after my transplant. So that was kind of a goal of mine. And really now the trails are just as much for my emotional well-being as my physical. It's my wife knows when I've had a bad day at work that I'm going to go out and find some trails. And again, they're 10, 15 minutes away from me here. So
the transplant to trails, or the race that you just talked about, that happened after your second transplant?
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier in the show that your second transplant was you were sicker coming into it. So tell us, did you have that feeling of waking up and within hours feeling better? Did you recognize the difference?
Yeah, to a certain extent I did. It's an interesting commentary on transplant medicine. I thought being older, the second transplant would maybe be a little bit harder, but I think medicine has advanced such that my recovery from my second transplant was actually easier than my recovery from my first. And I did feel really a lot better pretty quickly after. And
yeah, when I was on the floor, we call it the transplant floor, my late husband didn't have your outcome, obviously, and so I was there a long time, 6 weeks, seeing people literally come in and get a heart and go home by the end of the week. You're up and out of bed within hours.
Right.
All of these things, that it is a lot of how people are treated these days after a procedure. They know now it's not good to lie around. You're supposed to get up and get moving. And I was fascinated. I met one gentleman when we were in at the clinic getting through all the testing that they go to have you listed for transplant. And there was a man who was there who was there for his new kidney. He'd had his about 16 years, and he was in and out in like 4 days or something.
Yeah.
And it was just amazing. I've seen so much of that over the years. That's just, I believe in it so much. Even if it didn't work for us, it's a chance to try, a chance to try. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story. And I know, tell me, we're going to share some photos from your trails. We've been doing that throughout this segment. Do you have a favorite? Do you have a place that nobody should miss out seeing in their life?
Well, in the winter, I live about 15 minutes away from an area where they groom about 20 miles of cross-country trails. So I usually get up there 2 or 3 times a week in the winter. And then summer, it's usually trail running or mountain biking again in a lot of the same area. I'm pretty close to Snow Basin Ski Resort, and they have a lot of trails for running and biking that will open up here in a couple of weeks. So,
well, I live in a beautiful part of the country as well. I don't know if you've ever heard of Wenatchee, Washington, or been here, but same thing, trails outside our door, ski outside our door. And you're very smart not to mention any of the trails specifically, because last thing you want is for people to be showing up on your trails, taking up the space that you need desperately for your well-being. So, well, thank you so much for being here and making the time. I know you're busy, and I just appreciate it. And I hope people who are watching have a greater understanding of the magnitude and impact that transplant can have. So for people who are watching, if you are a registered donor because it's on your driver's license, that's not quite enough. It is and it isn't. So if you go to DonateLife, donatelife.net, you can register officially to become an organ donor. Make sure that if you move or something happens with your driver's license, if it expires, that you are in a national database. So it's important to know that that's an extra step. Talk to your family, talk to your healthcare provider. Thank you so much, Steve Wynn, and follow Steve Wynn, Transplant to Trails, on Instagram. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, you too.